Matthew, good to see you again.
Thanks for having me.
Any time. Okay, we're going to get into some deep topics here today. I know you've been on the show before, but if people are listening now and they haven't listened, we'll definitely go back and listen to the other show. But can you just give people like an intro to who you are and the work you do?
Certainly. So I have sort of a non-traditional background. My undergrad was in physics and philosophy. I did a master's in philosophy and public policy. Found my way to DC, worked for the National Science Foundation for 2 years, and then stumbled into consulting for the government on sort of range of projects for the past 10 years. Generally, the through line is helping the government sort of think through and prepare for bad scenarios, and then assess how they're prepared for those bad scenarios. And then also along the way, do various assessments of emerging technology and sort of jump around from project to project. I originally shifted last year away from sort of government-focused security consulting to private sector security consulting. So I joined a firm called the Krebs Stamos Group, which is a startup focusing on the intersection of geopolitical and cybersecurity risk, and really advising multinationals, sort of like their senior sort of business strategy. And so I recently took over as the director for security intelligence there. I'm also affiliated with the Bitcoin Policy Institute as a national security fellow. About a year ago, connected with those guys, and really trying to help put out some rigorous, long form and insightful analysis, at least I think, on the intersection of Bitcoin and U.S. national security. So yeah, I jump around and try to keep myself busy.
And what are some of those bad scenarios that we should be worried about right now?
Well, right now, that's a Pandora's box. So geopolitically, right, we're entering an environment of increasing tension. I think that's pretty obvious. And there's things that are going to be, the major flashpoints that everyone focuses on, like Ukraine, like Taiwan, like U.S.-China, continued frictions across lots of different policy domains. But there's lots of things that, when you have an environment that we're in where folks are trying to challenge the status quo order, you can have volatility erupt in places maybe you didn't expect, and lots of interdependencies can sort of cascade. And so there's lots of risks. There's risks from cybersecurity, risks from novel pandemics that these things aren't going to go back in the bottle. Risks just from how modern societies confront the rising risks themselves, and sort of the reflexivity that our political systems are maybe not necessarily sort of postured for. So yeah, there's a lot there. We can go on any one of those risks. But one of the things I did over a number of years was help government think through those things systematically. One of the things the U.S. government tries to do is try to be prepared for lots of bad things. Even if they're low probability, high consequence events, you want to have a plan for them. And so you don't necessarily expect there to be a low yield nuclear device going off in a city. But if it does, that would be like a catastrophic event. So you have to prepare and plan for that type of scenario. So did those sorts of things for a number of years.
And you've obviously been down the Bitcoin rabbit hole. You've come out of it as somebody who's pro-Bitcoin. Mm-hmm. Why so? Like, why are you pro-Bitcoin, and why do you think it's important for America to adopt and allow for Bitcoin to flourish?
Well, that gets to, I think, one of the larger theses I have about the coming decade, which is the major sources that underpin American hegemonic power are going to be increasingly challenged by both adversaries, aggressively attempting to undermine those sources of national power, but also just sort of what you would imagine is just sort of inevitable decay of institutional systems when you reached a peak power and the systems that were designed or optimized for a certain global environment maybe aren't so well suited to a changing global and technological and cultural environment. And I think our overall institutional framework, including our monetary arrangement, are sort of struggling to keep pace with both the sort of endogenous decay of those institutional structures as well as the aggressive sort of exogenous attack that our adversaries are attempting to place to sort of reset the global order on their terms. And so I see Bitcoin sort of as one element of how to think through navigating this turbulent geopolitical period as like a backup plan, at least in the medium term, because we're placing a lot of chips on the existing structures, in particular the U.S. Treasury market, which in my view is going to become an increasing source of vulnerability and a source of fragility in sort of the global monetary system, which underpins U.S. global hegemonic power ultimately. And that the function of U.S. Treasury security in particular as the global reserve asset, sort of underpinning the global monetary system and the global trade and finance system that everyone's sort of become used to for the past 50 years, when that system starts to reach points of vulnerability, that puts the U.S. sort of position in jeopardy. And I think we need to explore, even non-traditional sort of backup plans, just to kind of put a bumper sticker on it, right? Like there are, serious attempts that our adversaries are going to try to take to use the vulnerabilities that exist in the global financial system against us. Our plan A is to double down on the U.S. Treasury security market and do what we can to enforce financial repression and keep that market as stable as possible. But that is maybe that works, maybe it doesn't. What if it fails? And our adversaries are attempting to recreate a Eurasian commodity block where they can try to de-dollarize as much as they can to insulate themselves from sanctions. And to sort of carve out a sphere of influence where they can be protected from U.S. interference. And we don't really have a really good strategy other than to sort of reinforce what we've already been doing for the past 20, 30 years. And so I think Bitcoin is a novel phenomenon that's emerging to this very complicated and contested geopolitical environment that's not really being explored. And so the first thesis I have is it just needs to be looked at seriously. That's like the first objective. And then think through, in a more serious way, like what would be the conditions under which we could seek to take advantage relative to our adversaries if Bitcoin were to succeed this decade? And what would be the second order consequences that could redound to our relative advantage against our adversaries if they're trying to move towards more of an analog 19th century cold style system, and to pair that with a view of global state relations that also harkens back to that period, kind of the concept of Europe, sort of great powers carve up the world kind of idea. Okay, well, that's not a very attractive kind of proposition. And if they're moving towards analog gold, can we sort of pivot to digital gold as a backup plan? And so that's an interesting sort of thesis. I think there is other consequences that need to be analyzed for that. I wasn't saying we just need to go all in on Bitcoin tomorrow, right? These are big world historical structural factors that are going to become major questions and live issues this decade. So I think just first order business is treating Bitcoin with sort of intellectual seriousness and seriousness from a geopolitical and national security perspective, and start putting it on the table and thinking through how we can take advantage of it.
When you talk about adversaries, do you apply any kind of moral framework to how this kind of adversarial relationships work? And in doing so, are there fair criticisms that you can make back at the United States to see why these countries aren't working into a maybe more cooperative way?
Well, so my first step is to try to just treat things purely analytically. And sometimes that means you have to be apolitical first. It's just to understand what is the structure of power, what are the historical dynamics, what are the national interests at stake. That's sort of in the school of international relations, like realism, right? It's just to understand and make sure that you're not clouding your view of what is by what you think should be. Because sometimes folks, will want to impose a view that is, maybe what they desire, what they think is morally good, from what, they should accurately assess is the current state of the situation or what is like a likely, evolution of the global environment. But I think you have to be committed to certain principles. But I think I separate those two in different buckets, right? First is trying to understand as rigorously as possible the current balance of power arrangements. What are the systems, both financial systems, economic systems, political systems, military systems, intelligence systems, cultural systems, systems of elite power production. Like all these are the systems that dominate our global environment, that set the rules and set the patterns of constraint and motivation that drive our global order. Just trying to understand what those things are. It's like first condition. It's very hard, almost impossible. And then saying, okay, what is a desirable state of affairs, right? What is a better situation? And I think like for me, there are clear differences in worldviews between what you might call like the rules-based liberal order, dominated by the West, and sort of the rising, authoritarian challengers. You might call the kind of a axis of authoritarians emerging out of Eurasia, and they have very different worldviews that are also historically explainable, right? They have a very different cultural background, very different political environment, very different historical experience. But I think as someone who lives in the West that has a commitment to liberal values and freedom of expression and rule of law and human rights, like these are things that I would like to succeed relative to the political projects of, say, the Chinese Communist Party. And so like when it comes down to it, like my personal views are that, I would much rather have there be a world that is much more open, much more aligned with individual autonomy and freedom of expression than a world that involves state coercion and oppression and oligarchic rent extraction. Like these are things that I would not want to see succeed in the world. But I think it's important to separate that moral view from just a realistic assessment of how the world could evolve. Like the world doesn't necessarily, align to your normative prescriptions.
And so, like, when considering this kind of balance of power, the US has been the dominant, arguably only superpower for the last couple of decades. I'm sure some Russians listening would argue back. But we have seen the rise of China. Is there a distinct possibility that this balance of power will shift and that maybe China could become the dominant global power?
So there's quite a live debate over the structure of the global power arrangement. In particular, different scenarios that have been sort of put under the umbrella of unipolarity, bipolarity, and multipolarity. There's a fringe view that thinks that China, would just like take over and become the new unipolar hegemon. I think that's still kind of a fringe view, but that still opens the door for, quite a wide range of scenarios that involve a relative diminution of US unipolar hegemonic power and potential distribution of more decentralized sort of arrangements, what you might call like a multipolar system, or an arrangement where it's basically just like a new Cold War, right? Where we sort of divide up the world as a bifurcation between sort of a Sino-centric system and a US-led system. And those sorts of, those two systems essentially have to figure out how to not blow each other up over the coming decades. So that is the live debate. I hear, convincing arguments. For me, it all comes down to timescales, right? Like what kind of question are you trying to ask? And if you say, is US going to lose its global hegemonic position next year? Very unlikely. 2030 is an open question. And I think that's really where, for me, I sort of set the time horizon for any sort of analysis is, 5-10 years is probably the most important period to really assess. I think that's where a lot of these latent sort of dynamics and friction points in the global system are going to come to a head. And you're going to see, if you're going to see a disruption to the global order, you're going to see it probably in the next 5 or 10 years. Now, how it shakes out is an open question. And for me, the concerning part is usually, if you look through history, these environments where you have a status quo power, that is, in charge of global security, that its currency is the global reserve currency. It sets the rules basically of the global arrangement, and other powers essentially defer to it. When that system starts getting challenged by rising, strengthening military powers, economic powers, and powers especially that have an ideological view that runs counter to the system of rules that the status quo power wants to impose, usually those don't end up going so peacefully, right? Usually those end up with a great power confrontation where ultimately the sort of tit for tat escalation of economic war, of trade war, of proxy war, of influence campaigns, of destabilization, of covert operations, and other sorts of things that always happen in the shadows. Usually those don't tip the balance. Usually those are the sort of prelude to, a confrontation, a decisive conflict that sets the terms for what comes after. So the winner gets to write new rules if they're the resurgent challenger, or they fail and the status quo power basically gets a new lease on life. And that I think is the environment we're going to be facing in the next few years is really China is going to attempt to try to, rise and carve out a larger sphere of influence, and the U.S. is going to challenge it and try to contain it. And that can spill over into lots of bad scenarios.
And with your work, are you only looking at how it shakes out, or do you also consider defensive moves to stop this?
So my day-to-day job is as the director of security intelligence for Krebs Stamos Group. We help advise multinationals on how these geopolitical trends are going to intersect with the business environment and cybersecurity risks in particular. So there's like a tactical translation of this strategic question down to, how multinationals posture themselves for a world that's going to be very different than the world that they built their businesses for the past 20, 30 years. Globalization, especially premised on China's opening, where Western capital poured into China and there was massive technology transfer. There was, entire rewriting of the global trade and supply chain system, production system to China. And that is a system that's very hard to just reverse. But they're clear sort of national priorities from the West, and now it's translating a lot into boardrooms, is to reverse that. But it's very hard. Like these are very complex networks and investments and sort of structures that were built up over 20, 30 years. And they don't just, flip on a dime. And so that is a lot of what like day to day is helping navigate this terrain for, companies that, have to balance very different interests, right? And some have exposure to like onshore manufacturing facilities. Some have exposure to supply chain risks. Some have exposure, from a digital threat environment, insider threats. So there's this sort of larger geopolitical story, starts to have these second order consequences down to how businesses think about their risk environment and how they think about the competitive landscape in the next several years. And there's only so much you can try to predict, right? And a lot of these companies also have to hedge their bets, and that itself can be a self-perpetuating sort of feedback loop, right? Where if you think that there's a material chance of, say, a Taiwan event that might disrupt supply chains, you have to hedge against that risk now, even if you think it's a low probability event. But it becomes a material scenario that you, as a fiduciary to your shareholders, has to like plan for. And then all your competitors have to do the same thing. And that can create, a momentum to sort of de-risk your China operations that involves moving and relocating and building up redundancies and changing the way your network architectures are structured. And these things are expensive. They're often very complicated. And that's really the situation we're in right now, is sort of the globalized sort of multinational structure that was premised for 20, 30 years on basically China seamlessly integrating into the global system is really breaking, or it's in the process of posturing for a potential break, which involves basically a pretty substantial reordering of those sorts of structures.
And so, in terms of it breaking, like what is like the key evidence? What are the things that you're seeing that highlights that it's breaking?
Well, breaking for me, so I study physics, and so I think about these as like complex nonlinear systems, right? Where you can hit them like glass. You can tap on glass and you get some vibration. You're perturbing it in some way, but it's not materially changing its structure. And then there's some threshold point, not quite sure exactly what it is, that if you increase the force of that perturbation, it breaks. It's sort of a phase transition. You boil water to 99 degrees, you start seeing some bubbles, and then you go to 100 degrees, and now it's starts showing very different dynamics. And I think we're in that like tap, tap, tap with increasing force, or turning up the heat, closer to 99 degrees, where you don't know how far away you are from that like critical threshold point where you might enter into a new regime, where, you go from a regime of kind of stable feedback loops that start to, you hit something and then it sort of starts to come back to its original state to, it's tipped past a point where those stabilizers can really be effective. And then different sort of set of feedback loops, like vicious spirals, start to kick into place where everyone has to get out, everyone has to sell, everyone has to, be the first one to get out of Dodge, basically. And I think there's a lot of this like looking around, like, are we there yet? And I think some folks, it's a spectrum, and I think we're not quite yet to the critical mass. Right? We're not quite there yet. But the fact that you have like senior C-suites starting to seriously assess the probability of a Taiwan event, 2-3 years ago would have been like laughed out, right? That would not have been a serious sort of senior level business strategy, right, scenario to put on the table. And now it is. It doesn't mean that they're like preparing for World War III by any means, but it means that now they have to take that scenario seriously, which itself is like a market qualitative shift, right? And that in aggregate means that a lot of companies have to make a lot of different decisions. It also means like countries are making these pretty substantial decisions. And really in Asia, that's really the locus of this. So Ukraine gets a lot of the attention. It's very important conflict, but really like the locus of great power confrontation in terms of where there might be a major disruption to the global system is going to come in Asia. It's really going to come in South China Sea and Taiwan if it comes in the near future. So that's where I really be focused. It's
obviously a very high risk move for China in trying to shift the global power. There's clear risks to their own economy.
Very, very, yeah. It is a high wire act, and this is where in the analytic community, there's quite a lot of debate between the arguments that China's economic exposures, their weaknesses, their dependencies on the dollar system, their dependencies on deficit countries to absorb their surpluses, their dependencies still on energy and food imports, make them vulnerable to counterattack if they try to challenge that system. And that the arguments there is that they would not risk it, basically. So it's a question of how do we think the Politburo in particular President Xi is going to make that risk calculation over what time horizon. And I look at different analysis and different folks who are experts in this area, and it's a spectrum. Some folks who I trust have a credible view that there's no real likelihood that they would try to, make a move, for example, on Taiwan until the end of the decade at least, for a combination of both domestic political reasons, like they're just not, prepared yet domestically to, get their population ready for war. Also, their military capacity is almost there, but not quite, and they need time to, improve their modernization, develop some of these advanced capabilities to really increase their confidence and the ability to, prevail in a conflict against the U.S. and Japan and some of our allies over Taiwan. But there's others who think that there's actually there's a window that they might assess of like their relative peaking power, and that they are not going to go when they think they're most ready. They're going to go when they think they have the maximum possible relative advantage. And in particular, relative advantage to U.S.'s ability to create a counter-China coalition that is reliable and that is effective at both military and economic deterrence against China, as well as U.S. hard power military capabilities. Reinforcing our credible military deterrent in the Pacific and building up Taiwan's endogenous defense capabilities. Like those things are happening starting now, but they're going to have a major lag towards the end of the decade. So you have these different lines, basically, of China's assessment of their growing relative strength and trying to patch up some of these weaknesses that they know they have, as well as assessment of the external environment. And that is also increasing in terms of its ability to counter and deter China. And they have to make this judgment of, it's a risk calculation. At what point in time are those lines going to become, too close together, and where the delta is going to be the most in their favor? And the risk is that sometime in the middle of this decade is, where if you look at like the relative, kind of economic lines and the development of their military capabilities relative to ours, like that's like the danger zone, as one book calls it. It doesn't mean it's a certainty, but that is, I think, why there's so much angst about China and Taiwan in particular, is because there's a recognition that this is a very unique scenario. It's a very unique environment. Like the U.S. has never had a pure challenger with China's capabilities. Doesn't mean that they're ready to take the mantle of global hegemony. I don't subscribe to that view. But it doesn't mean that they aren't able to effectively challenge U.S. led security architecture and economic order, especially in the Western Pacific, which is kind of a big deal. And so there's a reason why that should be paid close attention to, especially because of the prospects for that spiraling into a larger great power war, which would be exceptionally dangerous. So even if you think that China is weak and would have no chance against the United States, I think you still have to take that scenario seriously, because it doesn't matter what you think, it matters what President Xi thinks. And then history is replete with autocrats and dictators who maybe have an inflated sense of their own capabilities. We have a good example of this with President Putin. A lot of people looked at his buildup on in the sort of the winter time and said, this is a bluff, this is a coercive pressure campaign, this is him trying to extract concessions, et cetera. There's no way he would try to conduct this foolish invasion. His military is way incapable of completing that large scale of an invasion. He's risking domestic stability. The Siloviki will just take him out back and kill him. These were the things that were said, and then he did it anyways, right? And it's clearly not been a very successful military operation thus far. And so, I take that as not necessarily all that encouraging that the Taiwan scenario is off the table.
What's the Siloviki?
So the Siloviki is the term for kind of the intelligence kind of elite that run Russia. So kind of out of the ashes of the collapse of the Soviet Union, basically the elite KGB officers kind of took over the remnants of the state and dominated most of the privatizations. And Putin was kind of a member of that cadre of intelligence officers who kind of took over the state. And it's kind of this, quasi-mafia, quasi-state, quasi-intelligence group that goes by the term Siloviki.
So a hot war between the US and China is kind of unthinkable, right? I mean, I know in your job you have to think about it, but
I mean, I don't think it's unthinkable. I think it's it is what the national defense strategy that we recently published basically is focused on. It is focused on integrated deterrence to meet quote unquote the pacing threat, which they define as China, and that's a market term from the last national defense strategy. and they're explicitly, focusing on very, very aggressively trying to reorient U.S. military strategy and defense capabilities to deter China, which basically means fight and be able to fight and win a war against China over Taiwan. There's a lot of attention being placed on that scenario, a lot of like tactical level planning, intelligence collection that's explicitly geared towards that scenario. And so if you ask like folks in the intelligence community, in the military, in the political apparatus in both countries, they don't think they're preparing for it in like an imminent conflict by any means. But there's a recognition on both sides that they're heading in the wrong direction as in terms of the bilateral relationship. The tensions between these two great powers is not great. Now there might be, I think, a slight softening in the coming year. There's lots of reasons why that might happen in 2023, but it might just be a slight kind of upcycle in this sort of deteriorating trend between the two countries. And this is the most important bilateral relationship in the world. These are the two powers that dominate the global system. They're also intimately linked in terms of their economic dependencies. And so unlike in history where you think about like the sort of the century-long competition / conflict between France and Britain in the 19th century, that's like one model that you can imagine. So some folks think that that's sort of the scenario we're likely going to be heading into, is a sort of this long grind of sort of relative positioning and trying to rearrange sort of relative power on the periphery without getting into major war, or it's a pre-World War I scenario where miscalculation, economic sanctions ratchet up into what people thought would be a quick war and turned out to be anything but. So this is the challenge, right? You have an environment where there's increasing tensions economically, politically, a sense of like insecurity on both sides. I think the United States is also like, we have the most powerful military, but the thing is that like we've never had a challenger with the relative delta that China has closed, and so that generates insecurity. And China also has a sense of insecurity, not because they they don't have confidence in the recent military or economic gains, but because I think they see that this window is pretty close to like Japan and AUKUS, and a lot of these other countries are not necessarily all on board with China dominating East Asia, and so they realize that it's a matter of time before potentially there's a counter-China coalition that can block them. And they have a geographic constraint, right? They're pretty much hemmed in the first island chain. They don't have the geographic advantage the United States has with, two peaceful neighbors and open oceans on both sides where we don't have to worry about, invasion. So China has, 20 different borders. They have 130,000 troops on both sides of the India-China border. They've fought clashes there. They're right now like have a good relationship with Russia, but they have massive long border with Russia. Historically, Russia's been one of their major threats. So yeah, they have a sense of insecurity too, and usually that's an environment where bad things happen. Is when folks are feeling insecure and there aren't necessarily like stable patterns of bilateral relations that can help contain a conflict like we had with the Soviet Union. We had hotlines with the Soviets. We had sort of many years after the initial sort of Cold War period to kind of figure out how to manage this Cold War dynamic, where we would sort of not fight each other overtly. We would fight in these proxy wars. And it was okay if, we were shooting down MiG pilots in Korea. There was sort of like, that was okay. We would never actually but we recognized that would not spill out into like a great power war with Russia, because everyone knew it would be catastrophic. We have not established that those sorts of, I think, as stable of a deterrence and deconfliction process with China, which makes accidents much more dangerous, right? Like a fighter jet colliding with a U.S. spy plane in the South China Sea could precipitate a major crisis. May not actually lead to a conflict, but these things are on the table. Or things like the Speaker of the House visit back in August. The Chinese reaction to that was to essentially bracket Taiwan with ballistic missiles that they launched over the island. They put their forces all around the island essentially to show how they conduct essentially a quarantine / blockade of those trade routes if they wanted to, and force the United States to basically fight our way in if we wanted to relieve Taiwan from that quarantine. So these are the scenarios that are being discussed over the next several years that if the relationship doesn't take a dramatically positive turn are issues.
Okay, so this has led us all the way up to your article, The Future Geopolitical Order and Bitcoin, an Initial Assessment. So I mean, it's such a huge topic to approach. What was the background to it all?
So really it was precipitated by the post-Ukraine kind of geopolitical shakeup. Because I think that had a number of dimensions to it, which brought a lot of these sort of latent sort of frictions to the fore. And so there are a lot of like interesting questions that I think were hypothetical that became more real, and that forced serious people to start thinking about like the way the global order is currently structured is now being placed under a huge amount of stress. And when you stress a system that's been built for many years, you start to think about, okay, how stable is the current system, and how could it evolve? How could it break? And you want to be prepared for that. So, maybe it's like this intellectual anxiety that I had about, okay, well, what does this mean? How is this potentially going to play out? That's why I call it like, an initial assessment of the future geopolitical order. One of the things that I tried to do in the paper was just like bracket, first off, like geopolitics is kind of like it's like a filler term for like everything. Like, what do you mean by geopolitics? Like, literally it means like all of human society. Now there's certain like academic definitions of geopolitics, that focus on kind of geography and the intersection between geography and political systems and military capabilities and, state relations. But in the present context, it really just means like the international order, which is like the balance of power between states, which are the main actors in the system, and the rules that those states subject themselves to, in particular, like the Westphalian concept of state sovereignty and the Concert of Europe agreement that you don't, violate the, territorial integrity of another great power. And that really is the main concept that Russia is accused of violating, essentially, that, their view of state sovereignty is sort of the old one, which is only great powers really matter, and other states are essentially, subject to, spheres of influence, and you're either with me or with someone else. And, that was there. And then you have to use force to sort of compel folks to act the way you want. And so I saw that as like a critical, like flashpoint that revealed not just the geopolitical dynamic, but really how the monetary system is going to become critical to this. Because unlike in the past where, we had pretty much you think about these previous periods of major historical confrontation, the most recent one, World War I, World War II, the global monetary system was not that well integrated. I mean, you could argue that there was a sort of first globalization leading up to World War I that broke in World War I. And that was a gold standard. There was lots of global trade. There was, lots of integrated specialization. And people thought that, in fact, there was debates in the British House of Commons that, economic interdependence would, make war foolhardy. There's no way that we would go to war with Germany. Like, we're so connected. Like, we are, so intimately dependent on each other that to, fight would just be insanity. And that they made the same arguments that you sort of hear now, that the degree of global economic and trade interconnection would make war, impossible to countenance. And then others were looking at it and basically said, well, the aspirations of rising states eventually decide, to go, and then economics starts to take a back seat. So this is why I think it's important to look at why I focused a lot on the monetary system in the paper, because sometimes you have this sort of technocratic view that it's just money, it's just the ledger account in your bank, but really money and geopolitics are intimately connected. And in a sense, the enduring or the existing monetary system is usually downstream of the global like geopolitical arrangement, right? Like whoever has the most like hard power usually is the one who sets the rules, and part of those rules is what counts as money, and who has the power to enforce what counts as money and cut people out of that system and delete access to that money system is a expression and demonstration of power. So if you're trying to understand the future monetary arrangement, you kind of have to understand what you think the future geopolitical arrangement is going to be. And so, Bitcoiners are obsessed about thinking about the future monetary arrangement. But I feel like you're missing a huge and probably like an essential component of that analysis if you don't have a view of what you think the future geopolitical order is going to be. So that's why it's like you have to have that be at the center of your focus, and then try to assess, the relevance of Bitcoin in some of these, future scenarios.
And did you come into this paper with a hypothesis that you were trying to kind of prove, disprove?
So I've divided it really into two main sections. The first section is really just trying to like provide a a schema to think about the global order, right, in different domains, and it gets really complicated. And my first objective was just to try to put some of these more technical and somewhat jargony pieces into one semi-coherent framework, so you can like understand what you mean when you say like the global monetary system. Like, what does that mean? And when you say there's frictions or potential vulnerabilities, like where, right? And I tried to locate, okay, in the structure of the treasury market, in the structure of sort of the technical plumbing of the monetary system at like the micro scale, like how does that actually work? And there's a lot of focus on like FinTwit, right? on all the charts about, well, what is the Bank of Japan's yield curve control going to mean for the US 10-year treasury note? What are the flows between different global like sort of money centers and the offshore Eurodollar system? All these things get very technocratic and very complicated. And you kind of have to zoom in a bit, but ultimately that's where, these endogenous sort of instabilities could erupt, right? And we've seen this in history. We've seen, from the sort of obscure plumbing of the monetary system, things break. And then all of a sudden the Fed has to do trillions of dollars of QE, and that has a geostrategic implication. And so, you kind of have to have an eye to like the microscopic details and then try to zoom out and say, well, what would this mean for geopolitical power relations? And so like Japan is a good example for this in the sense that, Japan is a critical part of the offshore Eurodollar system, for lots of historical reasons. They've sort of taken over a lot of, kind of Eurodollar offshore lending from Europe as Europe became much more highly regulated. And, post-Brexit, City of London kind of took a backseat to some of this stuff. And really because of Japan's closeness to China, as China integrated into the global dollar system, Japan became a main conduit of trillions of dollars of dollar lending into China. Japan is usually, not thought of as like being this major global player, but they are critical to this. But they're also geopolitically critical because they're essentially one of the closest U.S. allies. They're at the center of any kind of military deterrent scenario against China. They're a critical trade partner. So we have like a very close bilateral relationship with them across lots of different domains. And so seeing the intersection between these monetary dynamics, the geopolitical dynamics, the military dynamics, and then the rising challenge of China, especially in that East Asian sort of system of power, like these are like the things you need to be focused on. And there's no like one story that you can just easily tell that's like nice, clean. Like these are very complicated systems that all link together. And so I don't think I did a very good job of like covering it all, but I try to like touch on all the key elements of it just to like get like the sort of the micro and the meso and the macro scales about like why the plumbing matters, why kind of the geopolitical power arrangements matter, and like in the sweep of history, why we see kind of, this typical pattern of tension between rising powers and incumbent powers, between Eurasian land-based powers and maritime oceanic powers, and the different cultural political systems they have. Eurasian autocratic tends to be the match, and then oceanic kind of maritime commercial rule of law is sort of the historical inheritance we have from Britain and France. So these are like, they all come together. If you want to be hubristic enough to try to like look into the future and predict how the whole global arrangement is going to evolve in the next 5 or 10 years, like you literally have to try to capture everything. And then I try to lay out some like different, like a scenario with like different excursions, right? Like how this could evolve in different ways. And it's weird because, in this topic on, in social media and other contexts, like people have a lot invested in one particular scenario. Like it's almost like there's tribes associated with like, there is going to be a new gold, BRICS, commodity, Eurasian power block that's going to, supplant the dollar tomorrow. And, people get really emotionally invested in this. And sometimes to your earlier point, like, there's often this latent moral view, right? That like US bad, Russia good, China good, US bad, or vice versa, that people have as like their background, say, normative political views that they sort of weight what they think analytically is likely to happen. And so I try to like not do that. It's like, what you think you want to happen is not necessarily the way it could happen. And also like one of the like critical like risks in all of this is that these changes to the global monetary system and the global balance of power typically don't happen in a smooth linear line that you can just say, here's the steps. Here's A to B to C to D. And we are now 30% of the way there. And you can easily see that because the value of the dollar or the value or the percent of global trade being used by the dollar is X, Y, or Z. Like these, like people often default to these crude metrics as indicators of this change that may or may not be happening in this immensely complex global system. I think that's just like a category error. Like you're not going to get many meaningful, much meaningful information from those simple measures. You have to kind of understand how the global system is currently arranged and look for, ways it could just break in ways that maybe could shift the regime to a very different system.
So I wonder how, I wonder if people watching notice there's like a coffee suddenly appears.
Probably.
Huh. We should ask Derek. So when considering this and then looking at what happened with the sanctions against Russia and essentially the freezing of their US treasuries were essentially frozen, right?
So actually, Russia sold off all the US Treasury securities in 2018. What they held were dollar deposits in the Bundesbank, essentially associated with the ECB and the Bank of Japan. We froze in a coordinated G7 action on February 25th, I believe. It was that Sunday, just after the invasion, maybe 26th. About $300 billion of those dollar deposits, which was sort of by 2 orders of magnitude the largest sort of sanction on those types of dollar deposits that we've ever done. The closest equivalent was actually the Afghan National Bank, was about $7 billion or so that we seized when the Taliban took over.
So $7 billion to $300 billion.
Yeah.
I thought it was like $60 billion. I don't know why I thought that.
Yeah, it was $300 billion. It was
Jesus.
a lot. Yeah.
And okay, the sell-off of the US Treasuries, do we know why that was? Do you think that's in preparation?
Yes. I mean, they were making no secret of the fact that they were trying to create Fortress Russia, where they were trying to insulate themselves from Western economic coercion. That really started after their first military engagement into Ukraine in the Donbass and Crimea in 2014, where we sanctioned them. Nothing as significant as the most recent sanctions, but that was a pivot in their relationship to the U.S. and a strategic shift that they were posturing for potential additional sanctions. And so they sold them off in 2018, and they did other things to try to insulate themselves from Western economic coercion.
Bought gold.
Yeah, they were buying a lot of gold. Now they didn't quite insulate themselves entirely. Obviously, they thought that. I think they were a little bit surprised by the degree to which, for example, the ECB went along with those sanctions, and actually Japan did too. About 2 days later.
I think the interesting thing that you mentioned in the article as well is that people were really willing to self-sanction them.
Yeah, and actually this is something that the Chinese have taken close notes on as they start to think about, what sorts of backlash would they expect in a Taiwan scenario. Is, when that invasion first occurred, there's a whole series of official actions that happened. The most high profile of which was the sanctioning, the blocking sanctions against the Russian central bank, the ability to access those dollar deposits. That was certainly among the more strategically significant. But there was also a wave of just spontaneous corporate, exit from Russia. Fire selling of their Russian assets to local partners, just getting out of the country, and doing voluntary boycotts of selling goods to Russian customers. And so that sort of wave became almost like a moral panic in a sense. Like you were a bad company if you were still doing business in Russia, right? And so there wasn't like an official U.S. sanction. It wasn't like the Treasury Department was telling you don't sell those widgets to Russia. It was just, we can't be seen to be selling these things to Russia. So we're not. I think China looked at that and started to calculate, and has continued to calculate whether that something similar would happen in a Taiwan scenario with Western multinationals. Whether aside from the official sanction that, say, the U.S. government would want to impose, there might be waves of social media essentially boycotts that have to be reckoned with.
Put Apple in a tricky position.
Oh yeah, I mean, a lot of multinationals, especially folks that have extensive first and second order dependencies on Chinese production, are like aggressively trying to posture for backups. Right? Apple's trying to move production out of China. It's very tall order for them because they've, they were like one of the biggest proponents of Chinese integration into the global manufacturing system for the components. So they're trying to, spread some of it to Vietnam and India, but the scale of what they've built in China and the integrated kind of supply chains and third-party providers is just hard to replicate. It's going to be many years, and very expensive in the process. But yeah, that is a key different dynamic. And so in particular, like when we sanctioned Russia, there's things that we didn't sanction, importantly. Like, so we did not sanction their energy. We did not sanction the majority of their commodities. We'd had some like exemptions for like pharmaceuticals, kind of, like COVID stuff. Like we didn't want to be seen like causing like a humanitarian crisis. But it was like pretty obvious that like we actually created like a helpful schema for the banks to say, you can keep buying and facilitating the financing of Russian oil trade. Like, please don't self-sanction out of that, right? They were very explicit. They did not want to sanction Russian oil because they were especially conscious of potential impact on global energy markets and inflation. And so they were very clear to banks around the world, and U.S. banks in particular, that like, we want you to keep facilitating these payments. And so it's then been like a very complicated, very messy, almost year now of like gradually trying to tighten the screws in different ways as the G7 tries to do this in ways to minimize the blowback, right? And this is tough because Russia's the third largest, I think, oil producer, the largest overall like commodity producer in the world. It's very hard to just like cut them out of the global system. And that's how I see, the global arrangement right now, from a simple schematic, right? There's like three major power centers you can think of. Like in any economy, you have money, you have like raw commodities, like inputs, and you have production manufacturing, right? That's very, very simple scheme of like, you can think of it like a triangle. And, the G7 kind of has the dominant point of that triangle when it comes to money, right? G7, money, credit, and really also like the matrix of money and military and legal institutions. Like we dominate that. And that's by far the most powerful single like element of the global system. And then but that's just like money and military and law, right? It's like institutions, not like stuff, and it's not production. So the stuff is mainly coming from OPEC plus. So OPEC plus Russia, plus is the Russia piece. And that's, energy and raw commodities. Like that's how you have an economy at all, right? You need to extract resources and then turn them into final goods. And that final goods production comes from mainly China. And so China is the third leg. So you have essentially the G7, OPEC plus, essentially Saudi Arabia, Russia, and China. And when those sort of three elements of the global system were kind of in frenemy mode, when they agreed to kind of cooperate as part of globalization and specialize in those different areas, and we didn't weaponize the dollar system, they didn't weaponize supply chains, and they didn't weaponize, raw commodities, you had a nice global order. What we've seen, really in the post-Ukraine environment is like different parts of that triangle starting to break down. You can imagine like the sanctions on Russia's central bank reserves is like a big like weed whacker to the link between the G7 sort of military money system, legal system, and Russian commodities. And you can see what is now creeping up on the other leg is sanctions on or restrictions on Chinese technology, right? So like the various export controls we've started to place on Chinese semiconductor industry, which have really ratcheted up essentially the scale of our economic containment campaign against Chinese.
Is that just economic, or is that also like fear over what's in these technologies?
Well,
or is that a smokescreen?
Well, so it's complicated. It's both to a certain extent. So, but the big kind of strategic action that was taken recently to kind of up the ante was really taking what had been really narrowly drawn restrictions on Huawei in particular, and really applied them like across the board to a lot of Chinese technology firms and semiconductors. So really try to like stop their technological progress, to really hold them back from the technological frontier, in particular with advanced semiconductor chips, so that they can't design the next generation of AI capabilities that the West is going to be taking a lead on.
Was this the restrictions that are human resources, essentially?
It was across the board. I mean, these are very complicated export controls. They're implemented by the Bureau of Industrial Standards, BIS, of the Commerce Department. And their job is basically it's export controls. So basically saying that any product that uses American technology, in particular these like chip designs, it's very technocratic how it's implemented. Basically, you can't sell it to these Chinese firms. And if you sell it to these Chinese firms, will like put crippling penalties on you. Now, this is like a unilateral sanction. It has about a 12-month period to try to get some of our critical allies in this industry, in particular the Dutch, the Japanese, the South Koreans, on board. That's going to be a tall order, but that's going to be a real test of how much geoeconomic, coercive, and diplomatic influence the United States can exert in building a true counter-China coalition. This is what sort of is talked about on PowerPoints and sort of think tank pieces in DC. But the rubber that meets the road is going to be, can we get the South Koreans to agree to do this, even though Samsung is like a national champion and they have 25% of their sales in China and major manufacturing capabilities that they would have to, potentially take a hit at. So this is going to be a real test of can we incentivize, can we coerce, our East Asian allies to sort of pick our side in this attempt to hold back Chinese technological advancement.
What is the potential response from China on this, or what responses have there been? And what is the hope with this? Like, what reaction do they really want from China? Some kind of come to the table and negotiate and agree certain things?
These things are very complicated. There hasn't been yet a very overt reaction from China, and people speculate on why. I think my best assessment is that, one, they don't think they've yet been really effective in the implementation yet. There was some initial panic of like, when they were first released, there was a lot of like uncertainty over how they could be implemented, and especially on like Americans working for these companies, they had to basically quit their jobs, and there was some initial disruption. But China, I think, also has some degree of confidence from the Huawei experience, where Huawei was like directly targeted by like the full force of U.S. sanctions, and it hurt them. It really cut them out of kind of some of the smartphone market, and their equity took a hit, and they were struggling for a bit. But they've pivoted. They've adapted in the 2 years that it took, and they've shifted to servers and cloud and peripheral devices, and found ways to kind of work around it. And in 2020, they, aside from I think it was Google and Apple, were the only two other companies in the world that spent more on R&D than Huawei. And so Huawei is like major in telecommunications, 5G, selling that around the world. So we're trying to stop that, right? We're doing everything we can to kind of gum up the works of Chinese domestic technological advance, but also their ability to spread their surveillance as a service capabilities to kind of their geoeconomic influence, sphere of influence through like the Belt and Road Initiative, where they kind of have this package of, we'll help finance you with dollars that we have from our export surplus, and we'll, do these vanity projects. We'll, maybe some gold bars will find your way, into your suitcase, and we'll also help build up your infrastructure. We'll bring in 5G towers from Huawei. We'll also build in a whole surveillance system for you with Hikvision cameras and ZTE. We have all these really advanced facial recognition algorithms, and basically a lot of these aspiring autocrats or weak states can see this as just like a subscription model. Like, I'm gonna subscribe to the Chinese techno-governance stack. And
the new SaaS,
yeah,
surveillance as a service.
Yeah, and that is a major strategic threat from the United States' perspective. And so we're trying to do everything we can to stop that, or at least to gum up the works. So all these things are instruments of what you could imagine is just this increasing attempt by the United States and really our geoeconomic allies to try to forestall China's technological progress as a rising military and economic competitor. And that's where we are now.
Just going back to Russia, amongst the analysts, the people you follow, you talk to, has this been largely seen as a strategic error, or has Russia generally been largely unaffected?
Well, depends what you mean by Russia, right? So there has certainly been major pain felt by the Russian people. Their economy is, facing contraction, and they can't get the luxury goods. They, finding a car with airbags and satellite radio is very difficult. But like in any economy, right, you black markets flourish, and Russian elites vacation in Turkey and basically tell their interlocutors that we can basically get anything we want for a 20% more surcharge, going through Kazakhstan, et cetera, to get the goods they want. Italian handbags are apparently like the most in demand, high margin thing for those criminal gangs to smuggle. So, like anything, like the poor and the marginal tend to suffer, and then the elite find a way to get what they want, regardless.
But we have the same in the UK right now. As a result of the war, we have the poor suffering who cannot heat their homes and who suffering from high inflation, can't afford to feed their children. Anyone who's certainly upper class is not feeling those effects.
Yeah, and that's the sad story with really any major conflict is usually the rich and well-connected can find a way to kind of avoid the most pain, and then it falls on everyone else in society. And
the decision makers. Yeah,
and the thing about Russia is, this is not an unusual scenario, right? You can go back through Russian history. This has happened quite a bit. So Russia as a state, people have different claims about, will the state collapse? Is Putin personally, vulnerable from assassination? There's been lots of speculation about his personal health. That's there's ripe fodder for speculation about that. I think in general, though, it was a miscalculation. It was not a well-informed strategic decision. Like, he clearly had poor intelligence. He clearly expected the FSB's sort of sleeper cells that they had claimed that they had recruited in all of these local townships across especially eastern Ukraine would sort of rise up and spontaneously greet them as liberators, right? And they, that they could, take large swaths of the country, that the GRU Spetsnaz units could, do this crazy insertion into Kiev and take out the leadership, and it would be like this blitzkrieg, Desert Storm demonstration of Russia's superior military and intelligence capabilities. And clearly, that was wrong. Clearly, they did not have those capabilities, and it was a major embarrassment for his intelligence and military institutions. And so Russia and China has also recalibrated their views. I think they thought, that they could do this, and so they had to kind of take a second assessment of the capabilities of this now junior partner in the relationship. So, but like longer term, this is just going to be a grind. I mean, people have different assessments of the military situation on the ground. I'm not a military expert, but I think my baseline assumption is that there'll be counteroffensives to take certain territory back and forth. There'll be still very destructive attacks on both sides. That will be just a terrible grinding conflict for a while before there's any attempt at some sort of ceasefire. The problem is, like, the Ukrainians have maximal war aims, which is to get all of their territory back. United States has, our war aims are just to basically defang Russia as a military power, but we don't necessarily need to take all of Ukraine's territory back in order to do that. And the Europeans have even less of an ambitious war aim, which is just stop the pain from energy disruptions and overall and like migrant flows from Ukrainian refugees. So each of those actors is going to try to compel the parties to take a different position in any settlement negotiation. But it's going to be a grind, and I don't know exactly how it's going to play out, but yeah, that's a mess.
The US government's been very supportive to the Ukrainians. I think the last number was another 40 billion being sent. I'm not sure if that's money or weapons. What it's kind of irrelevant to my point I'm making is that there's been a lot of criticism of this, mainly in conservative right-wing circles, and that's just an observation. Do you think if it was currently a Republican government, they would have been supporting Ukraine the same? Does these kind of decisions, they tend to be the same whoever is controlling government, whether it's Republican or Democrat? I've got more questions, but we'll go with that first.
Yeah, so again, putting just like my pure analyst, like realist hat on, if you look at it for like a pure ROI, right? we've spent probably 5% of our military budget to destroy about 50% of Russia's military capacity.
That's a good return.
So if that is your pure measure of quote unquote success, whether that's not a moral judgment, just like, did you get an effective bang for your buck, given that the conflict already occurred? That's one data point you'd have to assess, right? I think a lot of that judgment though goes back to like a different political view of just the sort of antecedents for the conflict itself. And these are sort of interminable debates between, was it NATO enlargement or was it sort of Putin's revanchist ambitions that are the true blame? And I'm not an expert in the deep history of that area, so usually you need to have like a fact-based argument to say what was the causal root of any particular action, and what was the sequence of actions that took place that you can assign moral blame to the root cause, and then everyone else was making a reaction to that initial sort of morally vulnerable claim, right? And I think, I don't know, I don't have I don't have the deep like historical knowledge to say, okay, this is like going back to the breakup of the Soviet Union, here's the tit for tat, and this is where someone made the morally blameworthy decision. But I think the bottom line now is like, Ukraine was invaded. Like that's like the basic near-term fact, right? And when you are in that state of affairs, you have very simple options, right? Do you support or do you not support? And what is the threshold by which you decide to push for, coercive rapprochement? Where do you think you can squeak out a gain? And I think just from like real politics, right? As long as you're winning, right? There's no incentive for you to like go to the negotiating table, right? And so, yeah, I think that's where a lot of the political debates fall in terms of these are great powers going at it, right? And your moral judgments, you can have that debate, but they're just going to fight until they feel like their interests are no longer being served. And great powers will continue to push until they think that they've reached sort of the marginal benefit. I think that's what the United States is just going to do, right? So just as a realist, I think we're just going to, keep supporting Ukraine up until the point where we don't want to risk like an asymmetric tail risk scenario, like Russian tactical nuclear weapons or chemical biological weapons, or force him to retaliate against Western critical infrastructure, or do something like immensely more disruptive outside the Ukrainian theater. Like, those are things that would not be advantageous to us. So we don't want to push so far that it triggers those sorts of things. But as long as we can sort of grind out and just basically defang the Russian military with, from the larger scheme of things, like a fraction of our military expenditure, like I could see them easily winning that argument inside Congress. Like, yes, this is a good bang for the buck.
And it is 50% of the Russian military has been destroyed.
That's basically the assessment in terms of their overall armaments that they've wasted. They've lost probably 100,000 troops.
100,000 troops?
Probably, yeah.
Wow.
Close to that.
Do we know how many people Ukraine have lost?
Very closely held. I mean, people speculate, but I think I've heard folks estimate 30 to 40,000, roughly. These are all back of the envelope. No one really knows.
So there must be a limitation to how far Russia can push this if they've lost 100,000 troops.
Well, again, you're talking to someone who listens to other experts, so I'm not the military expert. They've drawn up 300,000 reserves. About maybe 80 to 100,000 of those have actually been put into theater in various parts. They've tried to use Belarus as a staging ground for training these new reserves. They've taken some prison conscripts to sort of do some backfill on the logistics. They've been able to reinforce their lines in the east. They're going to be hard for a Ukrainian counteroffensive to really dislodge, and they're fighting over kind of, what are more like marginal territorial gains at this point, as opposed to like in the early innings of the conflict, it was like wild swings back and forth. And now it's sort of settling into people make, I think, a poor analogy to like attritional warfare, like World War I. It's not quite like that because it's not as ingrained. It's still a very fluid situation. And also the capabilities are still changing, right? Every time a new capability gets introduced, it sort of changes some of the strategic positioning. For example, when we gave the Ukrainians these HIMARS systems, it allowed them to target much deeper behind Russian lines and killed a lot of their senior generals and interrupted their supply and sort of formations. And then the Russians adapted to that, and those started becoming less effective. Then the Russians started to bring in Iranian drones, the Shahids, and started to do these saturation strikes on urban centers and hitting critical infrastructure and wiping out Ukrainian power in the depths of winter. So this is like it's not a very settled situation. But Russia has like a 1 million man army that they're trying to build, and they have a lot of surplus, prisoners they can throw into the meat grinder, and they're getting ammunition from North Korea. They got 1 million artillery rounds they just bought. So I think people that think that the Russian army is going to collapse, not correct, but they probably don't have the capability to mount like a major new offensive to like seriously threaten Kiev, even though I think the Ukrainian defense minister gave an interview where he said like Russia was building like a secret army to try to, reinforce and maybe do like a new counteroffensive that maybe just to try to, get more resources. But yeah, there is there's nothing I see right now that's going to strategically tip the balance. And this is just going to be kind of like a grind.
What has this conflict taught us about money in terms of money as a expression of power?
Yeah, so I think that was one of the framing devices I used in the paper, which is, money is in our current context, and really for most of human history, is an expression of sovereign's sphere of influence, right? Where you decide who is going to be allowed to access your institutions, mainly your banks, under what terms, what rules of law. And you can, limit access to those institutions. You can provide an open capital account. You can have a closed capital account. So money is always an expression of kind of the sovereign's sphere of influence. And the United States has sort of set a global environment post-war where we could create essentially a monetary commons. And the premise of a monetary commons is that it has really no gates, right? Like an open park. Anyone can walk in and anyone can go out. The dollar was a monetary commons. Anyone could use it. That was why it became the global reserve currency, is because it was so easy to use, and it sort of also correlated with U.S. power. Like we were the global security guarantee to global trade post World War II. And so people, just endogenously started trading in dollars and denominating their offshore loans in dollars. That was the genesis of the Eurodollar system. And what we've seen really in the past 20 years, and really it really hit a new phase after the global financial crisis, was the global monetary commons basically broke. And then we've increasingly sort of gated it with the sanctions on Iran, and then in the last year or two, we're starting to see like more and more conditional access policies be placed on this, what was normally like an open global monetary commons. And I think that is changing kind of the risk premium that all global actors, in particular the most strategically important, like sovereign wealth funds, FX reserve managers, have to now place a new like political and geopolitical risk premium on their what was formerly thought to be like a risk-free access to global monetary commons.
But that's almost similar to what the work you've been doing with advising companies, right? In terms of what might happen with China, what access they might have, or they might have to de-risk their semiconductor supply chains. This is exactly the same scenario.
Yeah, you think about money as a technology. These are all institutional arrangements that go through like real infrastructure, right? So like SWIFT is a technical network, right? Fedwire is a technical network. The competing systems that China is trying to build, like the cross-border interbank settlement system, SIPS, and their digital currency system, DCEP, is their sort of proto-competitor to these global infrastructures. And so you're seeing this bifurcation and this sort of institutional competition play out across all these different domains. And the monetary domain is probably one of the more geostrategically important domain where this is going to be contested. And so, yeah, everyone is, and usually, China and the United States have the most power to sort of try to, take actions, but there's a lot of other actors in the system that have to respond or can push back in different ways. And so one of the interesting things I think we're going to see in the coming years is you might, call it multipolar, arrangement, but these powers that can sort of play both sides and that can leverage their either access to critical, resources like the GCC or OPEC, Saudi Arabia in particular, or folks that have like a critical geographic advantage like Turkey, or folks that have like major commodity, other resources like Brazil. Like these are countries that are going to have, kind of a new ability to play both sides. And that means it's like, when you have like one monopoly competitor like Blockbuster, right? Like everyone has to go there to get their movies. Netflix comes out with like a better technology and destroys Blockbuster. I don't think that's like the like people make that type of analogy between like digital yuan and the dollar. I don't think that's the right analogy. But I think you're saying essentially more like Apple Android, right? Where it's like, okay, here are two competing sort of entire technical governance, political stacks. And we have a legacy stack. It's very strong. It's a dominant stack. It's like everyone likes Apple. Everyone's going to be, but you're kind of stuck in Apple. But if Apple starts to like, make you pay up to get your pictures, right? Or starts to impose excessive fees on every transaction you make. And then Android says, oh, actually like, maybe you don't like us, maybe you hate Google, but we're going to like make our system just like cheaper for you to use, especially for you, because maybe, you're someone that Apple doesn't like. So like, for example, the Saudi Arabians, this is like a critical kind of like litmus test is, they were the key to the re-architecture of the global sort of geoeconomic arrangement post 1971, right? When Secretary Simon went to Jeddah and basically created the petrodollar system, right? Which really involved recycling oil dollar surpluses that they agreed to, accumulate by only selling their oil for dollars. And then they would recycle those surpluses into Western debt, US Treasury securities. And that put this critical link between, the essential commodity of the economy, oil, and the dollar, sort of to replace the oil, the dollar gold peg that broke in 1971 and sort of flipped it to this dollar oil arrangement. And so Saudi Arabia was like a critical geostrategic partner for us for many decades. And so them essentially, they're not flipping to the Chinese, but they are, recalibrating their arrangement to really play this sort of middle power role where, they want to be able to do with their surpluses what they want. And that may involve selling some of their oil for yuan. And it may be involving setting up these arrangements for direct bilateral like digital currency settlement and helping bring the rest of the GCC along the way with that with China. It also helps, it doesn't hurt that their ballistic missiles come from China. And they've got Huawei as their main sort of telecommunication service provider. And throughout the Middle East, China has taken this very kind of tack of, okay, we're not going to move in with like the PLA Navy first, right? Like what the West did in the early part of the 20th century, where first it was the British, then it was the Americans who took over as the major security force. They're mainly to like get the oil and control the oil and denominate the oil first in pounds and then in dollars, and that was like the critical kind of geostrategic relevance of that region. And it was military first. Wasn't a whole lot of technology, right? It was just like get the oil out of the ground and ship it out. Now China's coming in and saying, okay, well, we're going to start with economics. We're going to start with trade. We're going to start with digital transformation of these countries, and we're going to use that to sort of pull them into our geoeconomic orbit gradually. And that is the point of tension now. And these countries are also not all that liberal, right? Like MBS is not exactly all that on good terms with the White House. And so it doesn't take a whole lot to help him, to make him seem like he's on a better team if he aligns marginally with the Putins, the Erdogans, and the Xis of the world relative to, the G7. And that's a challenge for the United States. This is a different environment. And I don't think, we're trying to keep a lid on all these things. We're trying to, reinforce our hegemonic power. But every intervention takes costs, and those costs are straining our fiscal budget, our capacity, and we have a lot of embedded obligations that are going to stretch our capabilities in the coming decades. Like we've basically committed to try to build up a military to reinforce our deterrent capabilities against China. It's going to be very expensive. We've committed to helping friendshore and reshore a lot of these supply chains away from China. That's going to be expensive. We're trying to prosecute this like strategic competition with China. So industrial subsidies, industrial policies, like the CHIPS Act and other things like that are going to be coming on the line. That's going to be very expensive. We're going to try to rebuild our domestic energy infrastructure to meet our net zero climate objectives. That's going to be very expensive. Rewiring our grid and doing all this shift towards electrification. And we have the boomers retiring that are going to be making large claims on Social Security and Medicare. These are all very expensive structural forces that require a lot more debt issuance from the U.S. Treasury. At the same time that there's
less people buying,
less people that may have a a reason to hold U.S. Treasury securities. And so those are trend lines that aren't going in the right direction for the United States, in particular, putting a lot of strain on the U.S. Treasury security market.
Would you say then sanctioning the Russia's U.S. debt, U.S. bank holders, would you say that was a miscalculation?
I think history will see that as a major pivot and maybe it was inevitable, right? Like history is contingent, so it can play out in a lot of ways. But I think it was not. I don't think they thought through all the second and third order consequences. I think that sanction was done because we wanted to do something extremely significant, but below like the threshold of like casus belli with Russia. Like we wanted to punish them as severely as we could, but we knew we weren't going to do a no-fly zone. We weren't going to like put SEAL teams behind enemy lines and blow stuff up. Like we weren't going to do anything like kinetic against Russia. So Biden was like, give me like the most substantial non-kinetic, punishment that we can lay on Russia. And I think the guys in the National Security Council, talked to some folks at the Fed or folks at the U.S. Treasury Department were like, what's like the biggest hammer we can swing that isn't going to cause a war? And they're like, well, we could sanction all their dollars. And okay, we'll do that. And I think it was decided over a weekend, basically. And I don't think anyone modeled out, what folks in, say, the PIF or the SAMA, which is the sovereign wealth funds of Saudi Arabia, would think about that, or think about what, the Indians would think about that. Think about what some of these other kind of powers in the world that are critical to the, stability of the dollar system, that are potentially going to be gaining more relative power. And now they see that as a signal that if, okay, maybe the Ukrainian situation is, morally justified to bring the sanction on them. But what's to stop a future U.S. political administration to now wield this as a tool of geoeconomic coercion against me for something that I think is in my legitimate national interest? And now I have this vulnerability that I didn't really think was all that severe, and now I have to increase the risk premium I attach to it. I think that was not well modeled out. I think that's something that's hard to model, but it's also, that's the, those are the things you typically, when you think about strategic mistakes, those are the things that you look back on, you think, oh, well, this precipitated a whole set of decisions and hedging behavior that maybe individually doesn't change everything, but in aggregate can cause a strategic effect.
When that money's sanctioned, what actually happens to it? Is it frozen or is it confiscated?
So again, like in the fiat system, these are just ledger entries on a balance sheet, and they just have accounts.
Yeah.
And this is the Russian central bank's account, and it says you have say $300 billion of dollars. There's a little dollar sign next to the number, and they put a blocking sanction. Like it's a legal maneuver. When I said like this is like the matrix of money, military, legal, like this is like how U.S. Hegemonic power is really enforced. You can no longer withdraw from that account. No other institutions in the dollar system will accept that. The Bundesbank, as an institution, is prevented by law and under the threat of sanction to let you do anything with that money. So it's there in the sense that it's like credit in that system that could be reopened. Like it didn't like delete it. And so if, it could be used as for example, the Iranian sanctions, like we did something similar with them. We blocked them out of SWIFT, and then we sanctioned a bunch of their dollar deposits, and we essentially held them as like a point of leverage, right? If you do what we want in these nuclear negotiations, maybe we'll unlock some of those frozen funds. So they could get it back potentially, right? Probably not anytime soon, but you can imagine some future Russian liberal state that says, yeah, we've reformed, we'll apologize, maybe half of it goes to Ukraine as like reparations, and then they get some of it back.
See, if there is a risk of the US losing its position as a global reserve currency, and when you talk about less interest in US debt, but we don't want a shift in the power because people take on, say, the digital yuan, it's almost like if somebody invented a decentralized alternative currency, that might be useful right now.
Yeah. So when I think about, in this environment, right, where you have general degradation of interstate trust, right? There's like trust is kind of a abstract concept, but like in a geopolitical context, it really is critical, right? It means that your allies, but also, folks that are maybe in the second or third tier of kind of the global hierarchy, that they think that the system they're bought into is going to be safe for them, right? So they trust that the provider of this, hegemonic arrangement isn't going to weaponize that monetary commons against them. And when that happens, then they have to sort of hedge their bets, and they're going to look for alternatives. It doesn't mean there's going to be this overnight, flee from the dollar. There's a lot of structural reasons why the dollar is still very strong as a unit of account. For me, the U.S. Treasury security is more vulnerable as the global reserve asset, as opposed to the dollar's role as the global reserve currency. The global reserve asset is the function of the U.S. Treasury security as collateral in the global dollar funding system. That it's like what you have to pledge and hold if you want to engage in dollar funding transactions. And a lot of sovereign wealth funds and foreign exchange reserve managers hold Treasury securities as like the most safe and liquid asset. And there's two key parts of that value proposition: safety and liquidity. And safety refers mostly to like it's not going to dramatically lose its value over time. It's like it's relatively stable. Well, it's lost like 25%, right, in the last year, right? So that's like the quote unquote risk parity idea, where bonds are kind of like your the ballast in your portfolio is kind of destroyed. So that like pure like financial dimension of safety, but also just like safety from geopolitical risk, right? If you are a nation that may feel vulnerable to a future political administration, using your reserve holdings as a point of coercion, you may want to draw down on the extent to which you're exposed to that. And liquidity is also taking a hit, right? There's been major issues with the liquidity in the Treasury market recently. Even Treasury Secretary Yellen came out in like September and like noted this. And people speculate about why there was such a dramatic turn in the dollar strength around that time. It coincided with a whole bunch of international meetings where a lot of our allies were, saying we're in trouble. There was the blow up in the gilts market in Britain. Bank of Japan is still facing a lot of issues with their sovereign debt markets. So a lot of sovereign debt is taking on the chin. And U.S. Treasury security is, like as we see, right? Like the gilts are going to take it first. The JGBs are going to take it second. Like it's not going to be the U.S. Treasury security that's going to be like the canary in the coal mine. It's going to be these other kind of G7 fiat sovereign debt securities that are going to be showing kind of this type of stress. But it's sort of showing that the system is becoming more unstable. So if you're a sovereign that's looking to hedge out of that sort of inside money system, where are you going to go? Where there's sort of only so many alternatives, right? In like the traditional landscape of, do you just buy more land? You just buy up, and that's what a lot of countries are doing. They're buying up a lot of farmland. They're buying up, desirable properties, investing in, Western real estate markets.
What? Sorry.
Yeah.
The governments are.
Yeah, like for example, the Saudis, right? The PIF, which essentially is the piggy bank for MBS.
That's who owns Newcastle, right?
I don't know.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah,
they're doing a lot of investment in sports as well.
Yeah, I mean, they've got so much money. I mean, the Saudis and the Chinese, and maybe if you add in one other country, it's like $1 trillion of annual surpluses.
Well, I'm sure I heard that their revenue from oils generate 240 billion profit a quarter. Saudis alone. Do you want to double check that?
I don't know the exact number off the top of my head, but I know Saudi Aramco is among the most, has among the highest revenue, and it's like $1 trillion in annual revenue.
Yeah, maybe it's revenue, not like I thought it was profits.
I think. They print money. I don't know off the top of my head, but they print money. I mean, they're making a ton of money. I think the break even for Saudi's variable is like 60, but it's probably a lot lower than that. That's like the public number. But yeah, so the basic system is that there's a lot of these, Eurasian authoritarian inclined states that are usually either in control of hard natural resources or dominate global production, which means they accumulate massive amounts of surpluses. Those surpluses are mainly dollars. And then the balance of payments in the global system have to be balanced by net deficits. So as they accumulate ever larger surpluses, the West has to accumulate ever larger deficits. And so UK and India and a lot of Europe, especially Southern Europe, and the US have to run massive deficits. That's why we're running, historically large deficits. This is the balance of payments. the system as it sort of worked is that those surpluses have to get recycled into our assets. So we sell off basically our equities, our sports teams, our real estate, our like anything that's like desirable that these foreign reserve managers want to buy, they buy it. And so like it has really distorted our economy, right? Because it means that a large portion of our economy for the past 50 years, really in the past 20 some years after China came in WTO and it was accelerated or turbocharged this recycling system, is that like the sectors of our economy that benefited from that were like the fire sectors. So finance, insurance, real estate, the parts of our economy that were basically designed to take these global capital flows from China, from Saudi Arabia, from Russia, and funnel them into their economies, like funnel them into fancy Knightsbridge real estate in London, right? Mm-hmm. Funnel them into wealth management products from JP Morgan or Goldman Sachs. Funnel them into our tech firms, right? Why Saudi is like a major equity holder, or was an equity holder, and still has I think a position in the capital stack in Twitter. So there's a reason why these like the GCC and China and Russia have like oligarchs and a lot of like equity investment and control over like Western firms. And this has actually created a lot of national security concerns inside the intelligence community, because these are very often used as mechanisms for influence campaigns that the Chinese are really good at, right? In terms of like co-opting Western elites to, defang elite, what would otherwise be like elite resistance to the rise of a competitor power. If you're getting rich off of them, maybe you're okay with that, right? Case in point, Ray Dalio, Bridgewater, right? Who his firm manages like Chinese state assets. Okay, like this is what you would expect. Like this is you're not going to be people that are going to be for breaking the system.
And here's my new book.
Yeah, exactly. So this is the challenge we're in though, and this doesn't mean like they have everyone checkmated, because China domestically has its own major economic issues, right? They have massive overinvestment in their industrial capacity that they've tried to export, demand to BRI, right? So they take dollars from their surpluses and they basically do dollar lending to
BRI, Brazil, Russia, India?
The Belt and Road Initiative.
Oh, sorry.
This is the major geoeconomic.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I know.
So they have, lent, or mostly, lent about $1 trillion to African countries, South American countries, even across Eurasia, even to like Montenegro. Like they have like a bridge that they still owe. That's like the debt payments on that bridge is like something like 12% of their GDP. It's like this insane thing.
Or a fucking bridge, really?
Yeah, it was a big scandal. Or Sri Lanka, like there's a road that costs like $40 million a kilometer. Big scandals here. But yeah, so they've used the dollar system that they accumulate these dollar surpluses and they weaponize it by embarking on this program of strategic influence. And they had a really clever arrangement where not just like ports, but often like resource projects like offshore drilling or mines or whatever, and they collateralize the loan with the revenues. And so they take the revenues from those projects and they park them into two funds that they manage offshore. One is to repay the loan. It's like the stream of interest payments essentially. And the other is essentially the profit from that project goes into an offshore fund that the Chinese control, the Chinese state-owned enterprise usually controls. And it's like the collateral that if you default on the loan, weak frontier market, we'll just take all this. Like what would otherwise be your profit from this whole project, we'll just take it instead. And that's how they've collateralized a lot of these BRI loans. And it's usually people say the BRI loans have blown back in SOE's faces and that is like for some of these projects they have blown up, but not all of those flows are accounted for. A lot of this is in offshore money centers. They're going back to the Chinese in other ways. And so yeah, this has become one of the major critiques I have of the current, like the net is the global dollar system good for the United States, right? It's like, well, it's generated a whole bunch of these political pathologies where we've deindustrialized the Midwest, created a lot of political frictions as a result, to the relative advantage of economic sectors that maybe aren't all that net productive or innovative, like the finance, insurance, and real estate sectors, and it has become a major mechanism by which our adversaries, especially these Eurasian autocrats, can buy up our most valuable assets and also spread strategic influence throughout the Eurasian periphery in their attempt to get those countries on their side. Like there's a statistic that for every 10% more that a typical or an average African country votes in alignment with China at the UN General Assembly, they could expect to see 86% more Chinese BRI funding. So there's a clear like geoeconomic link between BRI and strategic influence in these parts of the world where we are trying to compete. And Africa is one of those places where like all the raw materials for the future of the energy transition are going to be coming out of these countries. And China has one of their top priorities is to dominate the renewable energy industry, just like Saudi Arabia dominates oil. And so they are trying to lock up a lot of these critical inputs to solar power manufacture, battery production. And they want to locate the futures markets for those commodities in China, unlike where right now the futures markets for most commodities are in the United States.
Yeah, I listened to the Rogan show with a guy who talks about the cobalt mining in Democratic Republic of the Congo. Did you hear it?
I saw the clips, and yeah, I followed the story. Yeah,
I mean, it's well worth a listen to. But he talks about a large majority of those mines are owned by Chinese companies.
Yeah. I mean, it is. In fact, I think there was an American company that used to own it, and there was such a moral and like public backlash or sort of dissuasion against being involved in that they divested, and the Chinese said, okay, we'll take it.
Yeah, we don't give a fuck.
They don't care. These the SOEs have been sort of given free rein by the Chinese government to just go out there and make a buck. And so they don't have as much moral compulsion, environmental compulsion as Western firms do.
Human rights compulsion.
No, by no means. And actually one of the interesting challenges recently has been one of the critiques about, okay, China's got all this BRI funding, but they don't have the military capability to back it up, right? So, okay, they have these loans, but they don't have the Fifth Fleet. They don't have aircraft carriers that can, have a, blue water, cross-continental power projection capability. And actually what China is really innovating on in a lot of these countries is, you don't need those types of military capabilities to really enforce these natural resource claims. What you need are proxy allies that you can get on your board, as well as private military companies. So PMCs is what they're called. And so China has really invested a lot in like their equivalent to like the Wagner Group, although they're not as bloodthirsty psychopaths like the Wagner Group is from Russia. But they're like professional mercenaries, right? They're not official, Chinese military officers. They are private. They're like Blackwater, basically. In fact, Blackwater contracted with Chinese government. Wasn't Blackwater, but it was Eric Prince's other company, Frontier Resources Group in Africa to do some of this stuff. So they're actually able to effectively project military power where it's needed in an asymmetric way. The U.S. government has a lot of special operations capability in Africa to try to do something similar. Where we have host government agreements to do counterterrorism missions that happen to be near strategic resources. But this is, I think, some of the canards that are played around to sort of be skeptical of China's ability to enforce these geoeconomic patterns of influence because they don't have 11 aircraft carriers. And it's true, they don't have those, but I think they don't need those necessarily.
Well,
and they're building them quickly.
They're building them, yeah.
They have, and this is
Didn't they just launch one recently?
They have the Liaoning, which is their major flagship aircraft carrier. I think they're building another one. And they got one more on the way after that. Yeah, their shipbuilding capacity is enormous. They have by far the largest shipbuilding capacity in the world, mostly for commercial shipping, but it's, that infrastructure is used for, naval buildup. And they've embarked on the largest military modernization in history. The U.S. government typically isn't histrionic when it comes to doing these sorts of assessments. But if you read, statements of the deputy, different deputy assistant secretaries for strategy, force planning from the Pentagon, they'll come out with pretty strong statements assessing how quickly China's capabilities have improved and how concerned they are about the deterrence capabilities of the United States relative to what China's been able to do across lots of different domains. And a lot of my day job is also related to cybersecurity. And so cyber is a major domain that stretches not just the commercial environment, but obviously the strategic environment and space. Space is becoming a critical domain of competition. And China is a major space player. like very big in space. So yeah, there's I'm not like a China bull, right? But I think they have a lot of demographic issues. Their political system isn't all that innovative. They've got a strongman leader who doesn't necessarily listen to his advisors on things. They have a lot of problems. They've got, these massive debt loads. So, but I think people that, underestimate, rising aspirant revanchist powers, history tells you that you should keep an eye out.
You mapped out a scenario or scenarios in your article. Can you talk me through that?
Certainly. So there's been a lot of like, hot topic in the like geoeconomic monetary discussion. A lot of it's precipitated by a certain analyst named Zoltan Poznar from Credit Suisse, who's written a number of these kind of notes articulating what he calls kind of Bretton Woods 3 thesis, which he sort of updated and refined. And just in the past few weeks, he sort of released different versions of it. It's quite complicated, so I don't want to go through all of it. But the basic premise is what we sort of were talking about before, which is, can China create a economic arrangement that gives them some of the similar benefits that the U.S. has? Like that's their like overall objective. If you think like longer term, is they want to have their own sphere of influence that eliminates all of their dependence and removes any potential coercive power the United States has over them. So that's like the high level objective, so that the CCP can endure indefinitely and they can have the great rejuvenation of the Chinese people, achieve the great Chinese dream, and resolve the Taiwan question in our generation. These are like the major commitments that they've made to their public. So these are like the high level strategic objectives. Those translate to having a regional balance of power arrangement that's in their favor. That includes also bilateral trade arrangements, trade agreements, and an economic and monetary arrangement that is not subject to U.S. influence or control. That's like the high level strategic objective. Now, how they get there is like the key question, right? And can they get there? And what's the pathway that they'll try to get to that point? And I think, for me, I think they have an approach. It's quite complicated, but in my sort of simple fish brain, it's like first starting with building up some of the like alternative infrastructure in case, right? So right now they mostly use SWIFT, just like everyone else does. Right now they, engage heavily in the global dollar clearing system with Western banks. They're intimately connected into the global euro dollar system. They have, over $1 trillion in US Treasury securities. So they haven't like decided to do that break yet, right? So they're not like, they haven't gone really that far down that road yet. But what they have done is built up some of these alternative infrastructures so that they have like the systems in place in like proto form, one to like maybe gradually grow and mature over time, or as like a backup plan in case they get locked out. And so this, two big ones really are, DCEP, the digital currency electronic payment, like that's basically the technology package for the digital yuan that they're trying to export along BRI, but they're sort of testing it in different countries and setting it up more in like these prototype stages, including domestically. They like really launched it officially at the Winter Olympics, so it's still very early in its sort of development. And then it's SIPS, the sort of cross-border interbank settlement system. They're really trying to build their own terms to basically Fedwire and SWIFT. That's like first one. So their strategy is really just like block, then build, and then expand. So that's like across lots of domains, it's been their strategy. Like in the South China Sea, it's been the same strategies. Like first, like invest in denial weapons so that like they can block US military from like doing too much in their immediate proximity. And then they want to build the islands physically. They actually built, islands in the South China Sea. And then they want to expand. They want to eventually they want to, push us out. They want to reset the balance of power in the South China Sea. They want to do that, I think, similarly in the economic domain, but it takes a lot of time. So they want to block first and just like protect themselves. They want to build these infrastructures, and then they want to expand them. And that's how they get to that expansion stage. There's a lot of debate right now, and for me, it's a little bit more speculative. But you can see things happening with these arrangements with the GCC, with Saudi Arabia, with Russia, for example. Like over 50% of the bilateral trade between Russia and China is in yuan, when it was like, 10% before the war. So like dramatically shifted to the point where that's basically completely de-dollarized. So all these arrangements, any individual piece you can be kind of skeptical of, right? how much oil trade is going to be settled in yuan, in the rupee, in the ruble, and it's probably not going to make much of a difference in the near term. But I think they're trying to like put in place the infrastructure, the bilateral like political agreements first, and then once the political agreements are in place, they can then coerce or influence major institutional players to make those shifts, because they're not going to happen organically in a market. like no one's going to market demand the yuan, right? Right. But if most sovereign wealth funds and major institutional players are basically coerced because access to the Chinese market, access to critical commodities is like kind of geopolitically contingent, that's going to be the major pivot point, right? Is when people don't voluntarily really adopt the yuan, but if you want to keep selling to us, or you want to keep trading with us, you have to use the DCEP. You have to basically agree to settle with us. That could be the thing that shifts the balance, and that's where we're not there yet. And they haven't pulled that card because they know that card will be likely like the point at which they're going to be challenged by the United States and across a lot of other domains. Like these aren't going to happen in a vacuum. There's going to be like the United States is not just going to take this lying down, right?
Yeah,
we're not just going to like let this happen. We're going to do lots of things, to contest this, and that's going to be a very messy dynamic. That's really what we're going to see take place in the next 3 to 5 years, I think.
It all feels a little bit like this. Like, how much can I push you? How much? Just like test a bit more.
Yeah, I mean, China has been very sophisticated in how they think about. I mean, it's like literally like the famous slogan from Deng Xiaoping was "Hide your strength, bide your time," right? And which is like, it's kind of a clue, right? It's like, what are you biding your time for? Why are you hiding your strength, right? Like the idea was their weak power when they first kind of shed Mao, and they had to embark on this program of global integration, but they knew that created lots of risks, especially after a post-Soviet collapse, to their system of government and their personal safety and their livelihoods. And so they had a very they had to think strategically. There's a book called The Long Game by Rush Doshi, who's actually currently the director for China policy on the National Security Council, and his PhD thesis turned into this book is like a systematic analysis of Chinese government documents to try to unpack and make a case that they actually have a grand strategy. And most countries don't have a grand strategy. And his closest analogy would be like Bismarck's Germany. And a grand strategy is where countries, all the instruments of national power and bureaucratic plans and agency resources are pretty effectively aligned over a long period of time to achieve like a high level national strategic objective. And that is usually, most countries don't have that, right? Most countries are just like, what's our next year's budget? This is our planning documents. We want to have, new investments in X, Y, or Z. But he makes a case that like China has this pretty clear grand strategy to grow into a global power. And this translates into a lot of different activities across multiple domains. But one of those critical domains was in like strategic influence. This has been very underplayed and still is a kind of underplayed. The degree to which China's been really effective at conducting kind of sub-threshold gray zone activities, as well as like influence operations in the West. And that's mainly been conducted in the West by the Ministry of State Security, which is their equivalent to the CIA. And this started really in the 80s. And there's a book called Spies and Lies by a researcher from Australia named Alex Joski. And he really like unpacked how like China was really sophisticated at using these front organizations for cultural exchange, trade exchange. And a lot of like Westerners that want to do business in China would go through these sort of middlemen, right? Like we can get you the meetings with the local provincial official, et cetera, but you come through me and we'll help you basically, get that business. And they were all intelligence officers basically. And so they're not doing the traditional work of spying, which is like, I recruit you as an asset inside, the government, and you give me the secret documents and, in the fake rock, right, kind of thing. It was just like developing friendships, developing relationships, nurturing, upstart political aspirants, in like local councils before they become major political officials. Like they had a very sophisticated long-term view of how to develop these relationships over time and really strategically influence our political conversation, our economic conversation to basically, and one of the like critical priorities for the MSS, like starting in the 90s, was like convince the West that China getting rich is good. Convince the West that us climbing the ladder of technology and getting richer and getting more powerful is good. And this was like believed, right? We actually thought that we could convert them to the liberal order. And this was an influence operation. This was a psychological operation to convince us that this would happen, that they would democratize as they got wealthy, and they would, liberalize their political system. They would do these experiments in local elections, et cetera. And it was all basically confection. It was a way to kind of, and we were willing to believe that because we just want to make a lot of money, right? And now we're waking up belatedly to the fact that they have no intention of liberalizing as a ruling state. And so that's the major recognition that it has occurred gradually, and then now has definitely solidified in the major political and kind of policy circles in the West, especially the United States. And now it's translating into these actions, right? Like total economic war, essentially just try to halt China's technological advancement, massive pressure campaigns, like really trying to, take on China as a major sort of pacing threat to the United States.
All right. So look, we've covered a lot of geopolitical stuff here. Going back to the original title of the article, The Future Geopolitical Order and Bitcoin Initial Assessment. So what is the role of Bitcoin in all of this? What is the potential? What is your thesis here?
Yeah, so I could see it play out in different ways. One in particular, so Bitcoin just as a monetary network and as a neutral reserve asset has very valuable properties that could make it play like a role in a system that is lacking this type of trust in the legacy fiat issuers, and also lacks trust in like the rising challenger, right? Like I don't think people are necessarily going to trust the Chinese yuan or Chinese government bonds any more than they trust dollars or US Treasury securities. Even if they sort of have to hedge in this bipolar system, doesn't mean they're going to like shift to the yuan as like the new top dog, right?
And possibly trust it less, but have to use it.
Yeah, and again, but you could see like a rebalancing, right? But it doesn't mean the dollar is going to lose its overall dominance. But it does mean that there's a role for something like Bitcoin to take sort of a different position in the sort of asset allocation portfolio for sovereign wealth managers, right? So if you're taking the perspective of someone in, say, Qatar or another GCC country that's looking across their sovereign wealth funds and saying, okay, I've got X amount of Western equities, X amount of Western and other real estate. I've got these mines. I've got, these just basic dollar balances and deposits and US Treasury security holdings. It's not an insane proposition for me to put forward that them allocating some small percentage to Bitcoin in the next several years, is not a possibility, right? And you can imagine them taking like a flyer on it, right, to start. But there is this sort of dynamic where, okay, they're going to experiment with it, they're going to test it out. But if a few do it in a small scale, it could become successful. And I think their alternatives are not that great. But there's a great paper by a Harvard econ graduate named Matthew Ferranti, and it's a very technical kind of mathematical paper. It's a model, like all models, that has assumptions that you could argue with, but it's a good kind of first rigorous attempt to try to put some math behind this question of, as the sort of geopolitical risk premium goes up from, say, sanctions risk to countries that are marginally geopolitically disaligned with the United States, how would you expect that to change their portfolio allocation away from, say, fiat reserves to both gold and Bitcoin? And he has this model and he plugs in different assumptions, and you can do kind of the parameter space and see, okay, if it's a high risk, or the different, assumptions about Bitcoin versus gold, you get a different distribution. But like the bottom line of the model was like, even in like a more conservative scenario, you get to like a single digit percentage allocation kind of makes sense from like a risk weighted perspective to some of those countries. And so that's like an interesting, thesis to have.
We need to talk to this guy.
Yeah, you should. And he can certainly explain his model better than I can. But that puts something on the board that I think was on the board before. And it changes the dynamic because a lot of these countries, one, like can't custody their own gold, right? So I think like people will just go to gold as an alternative, but gold actually has a lot of disadvantages. The reason why gold failed as a global monetary reserve asset is because it's difficult to transport, to secure, to verify. It means it's like usually ends up being centralized in the global hegemon's vaults anyways, like most gold is right now. I think most most of the gold in the world is held in 66 Liberty Street, underneath the New York Fed.
Do we believe that?
Well, I don't know. Die Hard, whatever that the
Die
robbery
Hard with a
ticket.
vengeance.
Yeah. But yeah, literally. And so if you're worried about the treasury securities that you hold being seized, well, then the gold in a vault in the New York Fed doesn't help you at all, right? So unless you're prepared to actually self-custody your gold, which is a pretty, Saudi Arabia could do that. Some of these big Gulf powers could do that. But the average sort of emerging market, it's going to be expensive. And sometimes it may not make a whole lot of sense just to transact in this. So it's it starts to add a whole lot of frictional cost. Even if it was a necessity, it would quickly become unworkable, I think, for a lot of those countries. And they would have to resort to the same sort of thing, which is paper claims on the gold that are held by some other power on your behalf. And you're just, choosing a different sovereign to sort of derogate your monetary sovereignty to. So Bitcoin is an interesting alternative because you don't have to take all those settlement, frictional costs, because it's just a digitally native asset that you can just transfer over this censorship resistant network. And it's super easy and cheap to self-custody with high level security equivalent to gold security to a certain extent if you have good custody practices. So this is a different type of asset whose sort of monetary properties, scarcity and its sort of bearer nature make it like gold to a certain extent. But its settlement, as a settlement system, it's got the sort of efficiencies of the traditional fiat system. So it's kind of mixing a SWIFT and a Fedwire with the treasury security into one kind of standalone package. Now it's very speculative, right? So that's got to be priced in, right? This is what Matt does in the model is, okay, clearly Bitcoin is much more volatile than any other current sovereign reserve asset. So it would be foolhardy to allocate a large portion of your holdings to it. But a small few percentage points to start, especially for folks that have a high sanctions risk and that otherwise can't self-custody gold. The model says it makes sense to do that. And that's, I think, how you could see it start. And that's like anything else, right? Start small, and then as the market grows because of that initial sort of capital injection, in my basic assumptions about Bitcoin's volatilities, it will generally correspond to adoption and size, right? It just takes more inflows and outflows to cause the same level of price movement. So as it gets larger, volatility kind of has to come down to a certain extent. Yeah. So as volatility comes down, it becomes, the risk premium associated with the volatility also comes down, which means, your portfolio allocation
is more
goes up, right?
Yeah.
And so that's how you could see this play out, right? Which is why, I wouldn't ascribe 100% probability to that. But I think it's not being looked at properly as a realistic scenario. Say by 2030, you could have several countries that have meaningful holdings of Bitcoin, as part of this rejiggered geoeconomic arrangement, and this is a way for them to hedge.
Do you think the U.S. government should be encouraging this, though?
Well, so this is the key thing, right? I think this is a ace in the hole for U.S. geostrategic interests to a certain extent, that we can leverage Bitcoin's monetization with stablecoin growth. This is a whole separate conversation, but you can imagine the competition between Bitcoin isn't really with the US dollar, it's with US Treasury security and competitors for US Treasury security, namely gold. But you don't have to give up the dollar's preeminence in the process. You can leverage what is very strong endogenous demand for dollars around the world via crypto dollars, right? So stablecoins. And a synergistic relationship can emerge between demand in a lot of these countries for dollars that are really hard to get. They would rather transact in crypto dollars like Tether and other versions of that could come down the line than the digital yuan. And that spreads demand for dollars. And if you have a proper regulatory framework for stablecoins that reserves them, so you don't get these stablecoin blows up or sort of frauds, that you could see dollarization take place in a much more stable way around the world than actually it happens today. Right now, dollarization is a very unstable process offshore, right? It is Eurodollar balances that are hot money flows, and they rely on treasury security collateral. And so when you have runs in the offshore dollar system, it's the treasury securities that get fire sold, and that's what causes the Fed to come out with these swap lines and liquidity facilities and repo facilities to reliquify the offshore dollar system to prevent like a total collapse of the monetary arrangement. So we've created this gun to our own head by making the treasury security critical collateral for the offshore dollar system. That dollar system has to keep expanding. That puts a lot more fragility on their treasury security. That is a source of geoeconomic vulnerability to us. So having stablecoins monetize alongside Bitcoin, it also doesn't hurt the fact that Americans hold a lot more Bitcoin than a lot of other countries in the world. So Bitcoin monetizes relative to other countries. It's essentially just a form of like seniorage, right? Because their capital inflows to buy Bitcoin, make our Bitcoin worth more. And so we accrue value, right, from their capital inflows into the overall network.
And also control a lot of the infrastructure in terms of a lot of the major companies have been established in the US, are being established in the US. So it gives a lot more control there as well. A bit like with the internet.
Yeah, I mean, control is an interesting dynamic when it comes to...
It's not control over the network of the code as such, but do you know what I mean? Like,
yeah, well, I think when it comes to like what sort of value system does Bitcoin represent? It represents a system of, like individual autonomy, right? The ability to transact peer-to-peer, the idea that, you have property rights, you can custody what you want, like reinforces the ability to like express yourself, right? These are sort of like natural liberal values that are sort of antithetical to the system that China's trying to set up, right? So you can imagine this is like in alignment with US like political interests. But you also have a challenge with the fact that, China is trying to impose their political views, in this sort of subtle way by exporting their sort of technology stack. And Bitcoin is represents like a very sort of diametrically opposed vision of a technology stack for a new internet, right? The internet has sort of become more centralized, more, with surveillance built into it, right? And I think people see, the trend lines of, tech balkanization being a major issue, right? Where data localization is going to be a major thing. Tech companies are going to have to locate data, say, on Indian users in India. Their algorithms are going to be subject to state review and approval. I think this sort of open era of the internet that people still maybe think exists is going to die. And I think Bitcoin represents the sort of last hope that maybe you can have something still like a global open internet. And it may not represent, this is, I think, what some of the work with like Web 5 is about, right? Not the Web 3 nonsense, but, actually building in decentralized identity applications and building in other applications on top of the basic network that can, create, a different type of internet than what we've sort of evolved into that is maybe not, fully aligned with our moral or our political interests. And it helps the fact that, Bitcoin companies are here. Bitcoin innovators are here. I think people have a lot of, I think Bitcoin's kind of a trigger word. People start to think about it as like associated with people they don't like or political ideologies they don't like. I look at it as just like a technology stack that is going to potentially offer us a novel geopolitical solution / backup plan in case our adversaries succeed in destabilizing the current geoeconomic arrangement. And I think we need to be seeking how we can use it to our advantage. And not just our advantage, but advantage of everyone around the world, right? If you think about what the function of a global reserve asset is it's something that you hold your savings in and what you think is the safest, thing, right? Mm-hmm. And the dollar via treasury securities was like that for institutions, right? But like the average person in emerging market, even the average American doesn't hold a US treasury security, right? I mean, only like so a subset of people that actually hold like money market funds are sophisticated enough or even have enough free capital to like invest can hold bonds. But the vast majority of the world can't hold a treasury security. So that like, I think implicitly, weights the power dynamic towards large institutions, especially in countries where the institutions are not all that, liberal, right? And so it puts a lot of the power in these countries, into the hands of those, elite structures like the sovereign wealth funds, the central banks, the government elites, and the people don't have access to those resources. They just sort of get managed by the political system. It's oftentimes not on their behalf. And so Bitcoin offers the premise of like, here's a global reserve asset that's like global reserve asset for the people. Like an individual can hold a tiny amount of Bitcoin on their phone, can also has it with like dollar-based stable coins and can, engage in a global marketplace, maybe with these other applications, and do an end run around their oppressive government. It's like that's pretty encouraging. Also, like more speculative, but like really encouraging is a company called Bridger Solutions that is just starting up mining operations in Africa, and they're going to scout these power facilities that like have been funded by Chinese loans, like major like hydro and wind farms that were built because of some vanity or political reason, and now they have no interconnection to any load center. So it's like 50, 100 megawatt wind farms, hydropower plants, just stranded assets basically. And, perfect place for Bitcoin miners to go, help the local community essentially monetize these assets. I think there's a company called Gridless in Kenya doing these things. And
yeah, we tried to speak to, what's his name?
Eric,
yeah. We tried to speak to him, and he... we agreed to do the show remotely, obviously, because he's in, I think it was in Kenya or something at the time. And I think he kind of did it with an iPhone on top of a hill, and we could see like this.
It was at the actual facility.
Yeah, it was at this facility, but like the connection was shit, so we've had to defer it. But we got to get the guy on the show.
Next week.
Next week, yeah, we're going to get him on the phone.
Yeah, so these Bridger guys, they actually come from the U.S. military and the State Department.
Okay.
So they actually worked in Africa for many years. Like they know the political terrain, and they know like how Africa has become this site of geoeconomic great power competition between US, Russia, and China operating in these countries, control over natural resources, trying to influence the host government. And here these are like, well, they're also Bitcoiners, but they're like, hey, like we can essentially like take the Chinese funded asset, mine Bitcoin with it, and it's an American company doing it, right? Like this is like, and we're basically teleporting the Bitcoin out from, the middle of the jungle, right? And so you don't have the traditional problems of like getting like a traditional, like if you want to monetize that sort of resource in those countries, it's challenging, right? You've got to get the inputs out, and you got to get them, get them in, then get them out, cross borders, et cetera. Bitcoin is like a novel sort of commodity in the sense that you can monetize these assets in these countries, and then essentially teleport them out. And yeah, so I think that's and you can do this. I think they're doing some, looking at setting up some pilots to do this. So, but that's I'd say interesting like alignment between monetizing Chinese-funded renewable energy projects that are not actually helping the local communities, with Bitcoin mining in a way that reinforces American values and American economic interests in these countries that are the site of intense geopolitical like influence. Like this is like speculative. It's not like game changing. This isn't going to like tip the balance of scales between U.S. and China by any means, but like that's like an underplayed.
It's funny.
Yeah, it's like that's kind of crazy, right? Yeah. That you'd think that was possible. But yeah, that's I think an interesting thing to keep an eye on.
Okay, so how do people find more? How do they go and find? I mean, we'll put it in the show notes, but like, how do they go and read this?
Yeah, so this was published in the censorship-resistant issue of Bitcoin Magazine 6 months ago. It's on their website. I think it's Bitcoin: The Future Geopolitical Order. An initial assessment. So you can go on the Bitcoin Magazine website. I'm also on Twitter at Matthew_Pines. I'll be separately. I'll be releasing just a random novel I wrote, so that'll be fun.
What?
Yeah,
a random novel.
Yeah. I had some free time before I started this new job last year, and I just sort of wrote this thing, and yeah. So.
What's it about? Can you tell anything?
It's basically about it sort of mixes spies technology all together. So basically, it's got Russian spies, corporate thugs, all chasing and some like tech cult billionaires chasing a physicist with breakthrough technology in his head. So it's about AI, quantum computing, spies, that sort of stuff.
Maybe check that out on my next holiday.
Yeah.
All right, wicked. Matthew, always good to see you. Appreciate you coming on and talking through this. It's a lot to think about this, but very interesting. And yeah, good luck with everything you do. I'm sure we'll see you here again soon.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
All right, man.